Hello, 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 and welcome to Getting Real with Paula. My name is Paula Alphonse, and welcome to this edition. We call it special because we have a guest that is maybe not the usual guest that I have on the show. Today we have Mr. Greg Fergus, and I'll just give you a little bit of introduction for those of you who might not know who he is. Greg Fergus holds the position of Parliamentary Secretary of the President of the Treasury Board and to the Minister of Digital Government. He has been elected as a member of Parliament. The first time was in 2015 and for the riding of Hull and Aylmer. And he's currently in his second mandate and he's doing well. Not because I have bias, but because I have seen him very, very much involved in the community, which is always good news. Over the past 25 years, Mr. Fergus has worked in the private, the public, the nonprofit, and the academic sectors, and he brings all of that to the conversation here, but also the conversation on the Parliament. So welcome, Greg. And is it okay for me to call you Greg?
Absolutely, if you don't mind me calling you Paula.
No problem whatsoever. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for making the time. I know this week has been a little busier than what it is usually for you. And on behalf of the Black community across Canada, I'm stretching myself. First, I would like to say thank you for the statement issued this week by the Black Parliamentary Caucus. And it is quite a call to action to the government of Canada. And I guess we're all waiting to see how that's going to translate. So today, we have you here, and we have two questions that we'd like to discuss with you.
Sure.
First, the impact of COVID on the communities that you represent, as well as what you believe the way forward would be. And then we can't really avoid the issue of Black racism and systematic discrimination in Canada. So we're going to start first. Yes. I figured, I know we had discussed something else before, but I'm like, it would be weird not to talk about it.
Absolutely.
So we're going to start with COVID-19. And what I'm going to ask you is, what is your perspective with respect to the impact of COVID and the way it will change how we do business moving forward?
I think, there's a great line. I forget who was asked. Some Chinese philosopher was asked, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" He was asked this question in the mid 20th century, and he said, "I think it's too soon to tell." I sort of feel that way with regard to the pandemic. In a sense, it has changed. Nothing, and it's changed everything. And let me just explain a little bit. There are a lot of the elements which had already existed. Your show, for example, online, has existed well beforehand. But now, in a post-pandemic world, we've seen this great shift to the digital. We were forced to do it. And so although there were elements that had existed, we knew that this was going to come at some point in some far-off future. It's now here. And the question is, who has access and who doesn't, and how do we make sure that everybody has access to it? So I think the move to digital is one aspect of things that has fundamentally changed. I think another issue that's changed again is how we deal with each other, how we see each other, how we understand each other. I know we're going to get into this later on and talking about anti-Black racism and the things that have happened. But in a sense, this pandemic has, I know you are much younger than I am, but when I was growing up, there weren't all these different communication channels. There were very, very few. In a sense, the pandemic has sort of brought us back a little bit together, so we're experiencing a lot of the things at the same time, and that's why I think those brutal videos that we saw coming out of the United States and some out of Canada has affected us perhaps more deeply than it would have done 10, 15, or just last year. We've become, we're sort of we're a bit of a global community again, because we've come together in this pandemic as we're trying to start things, or to understand where we're at. But there are also other things which have changed. Is, I think, for anybody who was very well-to-do and very privileged and thought that they were the masters of the universe, I think this pandemic has made it very clear we are all one family on this planet. We're not. There's no other place for us to all be, and we all can be brought down. The powerful and the mighty, and yet the low and the vulnerable. We're all subject to the same risk, or we're the same. We could be felled by these tiny little viruses that is causing so much disruption in our world. So, in a sense, there's a lot of good. I guess, like in any time in history, a lot of good can come out of this. It just depends on what we choose to value and what we choose to care about.
I love the way you say it's about what we choose to value and we choose to care about certain things. And for me, it's been one of those things where I recognize that as Canadians, we might have fared a little better than in some other countries for the structure of government that we have. Am I pretending that everything is perfect? No, that's not what I'm saying. But it's just in the sense that our government has reacted in such a way that I personally, me and my family, I felt well taken care of. Yeah. And in that conversation, it's always this part where not only paying attention to what didn't work well, but can we also notice those things that actually went really good, even though they're perfect, because it's new to everyone. No one here had this was on my agenda for 2020, and this is where I'm going. No. Yeah. So from that perspective, every single one, from the person who's an essential worker to the person who's far off in the boonies, trust me, we have to deal with it and figure out our path forward. And remember, as you said, we're all one person.
Yeah.
It is the humankind. It is the humankind. So
there's some people people forget about all the sacrifices that were gone into giving us what we enjoy today, right? I mean, a lot of the sacrifices our parents or grandparents had made to create that wealth that has become the basis of Canada's prosperity. And there's a Bob Ray, I think it was Bob Ray who came up with it. Maybe, I think he quoted somebody actually. He quoted a Toronto mayor. He said, we're born on third base, but we all think that we hit a triple. And we forget how much work has gone into this. And the reason why I bring this up is because you said quite rightly, the essential workers. So, the real heroes of this pandemic are not, the high and mighty, but it's really the people who stock our shelves, who drive our buses, who are personal service attendants in our old folks' homes, people who are not making a lot of money, who are working under very precarious conditions, putting their lives at risk. But they're the ones who really have, I think, are the heroes of this. And I hope this forces us to think, how do we reward that? How do we pay them? Under what working conditions should they be? And should we, give, it doesn't make sense that these people are making such little money. They're the most vulnerable people here. They've become extremely important. And so we're discovering what that glue is that keeps our society together. A second thing that you mentioned was, you were pleased the way we had dealt with this as a government. And, without being partisan, I'm just glad we made those choices in Canada. My brother-in-law is a businessman, and he exports a lot to the United States. He works a lot down in the United States. And at the front end of this pandemic, he told me, he said, Greg, I'm worried what's going to happen in the States. And I thought I knew a lot about the States. And I said, well, why do you say that? He says, because they have nothing. There's no social net. Their job, I mean, that's the beauty of their system, of course. Those who survive are the ones who can survive. Um, uh, he says, but if they have to shut down their economy, which they would have to do to stop the spread of this, so you don't have needless deaths. He said it's going to be a dog eat dog type of environment. You could see the pressures and the cracks in their social fabric come so quickly. That's the same thing. I think that's one thing that we've largely, not perfectly, but largely avoided in Canada. And we don't have people begging each other and cutting each other off just for the purposes of trying to survive.
And those are things we sometimes take for granted from the perspective of, in my mind, everything that I have is a must. And also then something like this arrive and it's just, let me rethink what is a true must. Do I really have to have that 72-inch screen, TV screen? No. Especially when it's not showing anything great right now with the news in that context. You've mentioned the essential workers. As per your understanding of the current reality within Canada, and that's as part of as you being part of government, are there sectors that have fared better through the pandemic than others?
For sure. Well, without a doubt, those who are probably in more white collar jobs have fared better than those who are in blue collar jobs, because a lot of those jobs had to stop, physically stop. But yet the people who are involved in the creative aspect of ideas and the creative aspect of and make money from that probably have come off better off than others, for sure. Yet we all can't live in that abstract world. We have ideas. Of ideas. The garbage needs collecting and the buses need to run, and people have to get to grocery stores or perhaps have them delivered, but somebody has to do that work. And I think what I'm hoping that comes out of this, as we build back better, not build back the same, but as we build back better, that we take a look at that and say, okay, now how can we change our relationship? Because obviously when the chips are down, these folks are so desperately needed.
Yeah. And, it's funny because we all have different class of systems within any society. And this has shown us a completely different perspective as to what needs to be, what is valued and what has true value. Right. So it's the fluctuation of the way we're thinking. If I go still on COVID-19, the provincials and the federal government have done quite a beautiful job in terms of financial benefits for the average Canadians. My understanding is that there's a group who has had a little more struggles, and those would be the small entrepreneurs who might not be able to either go back to their job or recuperate the loss that they've had. Yep. Any idea as to what could be coming in order to assist this group?
Well, there's a number of things which we did to try to assist them, especially for the private sector. If any place got the worst part of it, I was just today speaking to an owner of my local pub, my local bar, and restaurant, bistro, I'm trying to say, and they, she was telling me how, if it weren't for the fact that she had access to that $40,000 loan that the federal government offered to all small businesses, she knows that she wouldn't have survived. She just made it. And she also has a very strong customer loyalty base. So when she was able to open up for takeout, her customer base.
Okay.
I live in a small community, and we just support each other. And so, the people came out and ordered right away to have their food, and made sure that they ordered often to our local businesses, because we like our community. And what makes our community, what makes the glue stick, are these business people who put a lot on the line to stay open. So I think those small business loans have helped. They aren't perfect. I think the wage subsidy helped for organizations that were able to keep on functioning, albeit with reduced revenue, as long as they weren't, totally out more than 25, 75% down. We substituted, we subsidized their salaries, which to the tune of 75%, which did help. But it's not perfect. We know that there are some gaps. We're trying to arrange the programs to reach those people who are in those gaps. And the reason why we want to do that is because one day we're going to be out of this pandemic. And if you want the economy to grow as it used to, not the same way, but if you want people to feel good about themselves and have confidence in the future, you have to make sure that they're not so nervous that they're holding on to everything. And therefore, even though the pandemic is over, they're very reluctant to spend that little bit of money, right? We want people to feel, okay, you know what, I can go back out, I can go to a restaurant, I can go to my local business, and I could spend some money, maybe not the same way that we did before, because as we talked, Paula, at the front end, things have changed, and we're now valuing things differently. But you do want some, or if not most of that, to return. And so we want to preserve workers' relationship with their businesses. We want to preserve the businesses so that they have a chance to go out. And the ones who are going to really do well are the ones who try to figure out what's going to be the new tomorrow, and figure out a way that their business can adapt to those circumstances.
It's interesting, during the pandemic, there's a word that came out often, which is pivot, and how people were able to just make that switch quickly enough to get their business going. And as you say, those who had the know-how to move their business into takeout, into online deliveries, or whichever, are those maybe that actually would say add at least regular revenue, some type of regular revenue coming in. And we don't know, moving forward, maybe quite a few of those entities might decide, do we need the space that we used to have? Can we still do business differently from the perspective of where do I get the best return on investment? Thank you.
You see that with some high tech firms who have announced that they're not going to return to their old offices. Their staff was able to function from home, and so they said, okay, we'll close down the big shop. We'll have a much smaller footprint. We'll allow people to work from home because that's where they make their money.
And it's recognizing that for some people, they're still hoping, do I go back to work? Let's go back into my regular pattern and things like that. I'm not sure it's going to be what we anticipated. No. So we're going to move to the other topic, because I'm conscious of time and I know you have things to do too. In terms of systemic discriminations, what are some of your thoughts on the apparent similarities between the plight faced by both the Indigenous people and the racialized Canadians? And why is it so hard to get traction on the removal of those barriers?
Well, let me answer the first question right off the top. Yes, absolutely. It's the same battle. Just to let you know, I always like to tell the story that if you want to know that unconscious bias, systemic racism, systemic discrimination, if you want to know if all those things exist, let me just point out one thing to you. We know that Canadians are not, stark raving racists. They're not. We're not. We also know that Blacks and Indigenous peoples are no more apt to commit a crime than non-blacks or non-Indigenous people, all things being equal. Yet, when you take a look at the black population in our prisons, or black populations who are arrested, or black populations who are remanded, they're 3 to 4 times our demographic weight is being arrested, remanded, and imprisoned, and for longer sentences too, I might add. So what's going on, right? There has to be some unconscious bias, some systemic racism that's at work. If we think it's bad for the black community, let's take a look at the Indigenous peoples. They're 7 to 8 times more likely to be arrested, remanded, and put into jail with longer sentences. So we have to start asking some really uncomfortable questions in this country. It's not going to be easy, but I certainly know that if we don't talk about it, there's no chance that things are going to change. Right? We got to have these conversations, and not just amongst black people, of course, but amongst whites, amongst other races, for people to really get to the nub of the issue.
One of the things I noted, and this is my personal experience, I remember being in high school and doing the history courses. There were very little mention of blacks, or I think there was something about
you got to mention that's pretty good.
and some treaties with the indigenous people, but it was like a sentence that just went through very quickly. Would there be value in sharing, in bringing that heritage into the school system, so that the generation actually know what they're built on? Because if you don't know where you've been, the likelihood that you're not going to repeat the same mistake that the people did in the back is. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. We do need to know where we've been. And it's a funny thing, history. We sort of present it in high school when we're growing up as something that's stuck in amber. These events happen in the past. That's all it is. Yet, if that were true, if that were the only thing true, then when you and I were going through history, we would certainly wonder, where did women come from, because they didn't seem to exist in the past, right? It's the same thing about when we talk about black people. We often start the conversation only at the notion of slavery. There were African civilizations that had existed and prospered and were known to the ancient world. So what I'm trying to say is that what history gets taught in schools depends on what our present is. It depends on how we see things and how we value things. If we value women, if we value black people, if we value indigenous people, well, guess what? If once we start going and going through original source material in history, we're able to discover in the books, oh, well, wait a minute, Matthew de Costa, a black man, accompanied Samuel de Champlain and served as his interpreter with the indigenous peoples in 1604. Now, for him to be an interpreter, so that's the first recorded time of a black man being here in the New World, as it were, from a European perspective. For him to be an interpreter, he had to have known the language. How did he know the language? He must have been there before. Exactly. So these things invite us to ask more questions. In my region, in the Outaouais, which was founded, everybody talks about Philemon Wright, this fellow who came up from Boston, Massachusetts in 1800 to found this area, created what is now Hull, and what is Ottawa, Bytown. Well, Philemon Wright came not by himself. He came with a free black family, London, Oxford, a free black man who came here, had his plot of land, and exploited it, right? So for my region, yes, we talk about Philemon Wright, there's schools named after him, but we should also be talking about London, Oxford. who was here exactly at the same time, who braved the mosquitoes and pulled rocks out of the ground and, pulled roots and cut down trees. We should be doing that as well. So it's an invitation for us to look at history and ask the questions, who's not at this table? Am I seeing all that there is? And dig deeper. We'll discover the place of women. We'll discover the place of Indigenous peoples. We'll discover the place of Black people. And it will become a richer history.
I have two more questions for you.
Please. I have lots of time.
Because I know. Oh, thank you. We were talking about police brutality. And I just have to ask you, has your father ever had to talk with you?
My father didn't have to have the talk. We did, but he didn't have to have the talk with me because it was obvious. I grew up at a time in Montreal when newspapers weren't very sensitive to how to talk about Black people. And so whenever there was a crime that was committed, you would read in the newspapers, "A Black man committed the crime," screaming headline. But when it wasn't a Black person, it was a man, not a white man, just a man. So you as a kid, I read a lot of newspapers. You pick up on this right away. Let me tell you a little story. My dad and I, once I lived in Dollard des Ormeaux, and we went into school into town, and my dad taught at a school downtown as well. So we'd take the bus in together, and we'd walk part way, and then after the metro, and we'd split. He'd go one direction to his school, and I'd go the other direction. So I left him. I went to my school. At the end of the day, my dad tells me that he was stopped by some police officers. I'm like, "Oh, why did they stop you?" He said, "Well, that's a question I asked them." I said, "They said they're looking for somebody who committed a crime." And he said, "Okay." And it was a Black person. My dad said, "Okay." He said it was a Black youth. Now, my dad was balder than I am, had lots of gray in his beard since he was 40. And he said to the police officer, "Do I look like a Black youth to you?" So this is you get those, you have those experiences, and you realize you have to. People at the time were very house blind to the reality of Black people.
And I hear your story, and it brings back so many different memories for me as well. Have you ever had to have that talk with your children?
Well, yes. Now we live in a different time, and I think we live in a better time. We're lucky to be alive here, in spite of all the injustices that we see. I think on a historical level, it was worse before, and that's a crazy type of calculus to get into. But I think overall, I feel, look, I'm an elected member of Parliament in a riding that is not a Black majority riding, far from it. That's progress. That's something that I don't think we would have seen we didn't see 40 years ago. Or we had our first Black member for Parliament elected 40 years ago in Lincoln Alexander. So the conversation I've had with my kids is saying, look don't you got to be good. You got to be perceived as being good. You have to maybe take it up a little higher than maybe other people would have to be.
Yeah.
But also keep your cool. Keep your cool, and know how to. My kids were they knew how to respond and how to deal with these kind of things. And as far as I know, they've had no run-ins.
I have girls, and often the conversation is around voice. And I know I've had to have the conversation with my girls as well. And what pained me when I had to have the conversation is that they were not even in their teen years when it first happened. And it's just like, it's gonna get worse. But before you actually start wondering what this is all about, let me build some context around this conversation.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's done.
I've also told them try not to fear them either. We got to make sure that we don't, we got to give them an opportunity, the police, that is, the opportunity to learn, to challenge their own assumptions. But the burden is on us, unfortunately. And that's unfortunate. It's not right. No.
My last question for you.
Sure.
This one is a bit of a different kind. If you had a magic wand, name the one thing you would like more of and why.
If I had a magic wand, one thing that I'd like to have more of and why. Well, there's so many ways to take this, but the thing that comes easiest to mind is, and maybe the pandemic actually is, maybe that's the reason why it's come to mind. I think I would like things to be a little slower. I'm so glad we have this communication that's instantaneous and that we can talk to each other, and I can, press a button and I'm talking to somebody on the far end of the earth. I think that's great. But I think for us to get places, I think it needs to be slower. I wish we hadn't invented supersonic travel, or fast jet travel in a sense, because there's something about taking time to get to a place. I used to fly all the time in my previous jobs all over the country, around the world. And it wasn't until I became a member of Parliament that my one summer, my wife and I, or my children and I should say, my wife had to stay behind, decided to take the train across our wonderful country. It took 4 days. And most people would say that would drive them batty to sit in a metal tube for 4 days. But let me tell you, it was the most exciting thing I'd ever done. To see the scenery change, to really appreciate the distances that are involved in our country, to see the prairies, to see the Rockies, to see the forests of Ontario. It was amazing. And I think of how perhaps in the late 19th century, when they traveled, it was 3 weeks to Paris from Montreal. It was I think there's something to be said to slow down, talking to people. I met people on the train who I probably we never had that conversation on a plane. Get to know them, hear their stories. I think there's something beautifully. It's travel at a human scale. So, as much as I love the communication ability, I wish we could just slow down our travel. Take more time.
Yeah. I think you're a man after my heart as well, because time was also the thing I would say. Have the time to actually enjoy those moments that are significant. Because to me, regardless of everything that was taking place within COVID, that's the one thing I feel the most blessed with, is having the time to actually just enjoy every day rather than rush through the days. So it's going to be a whole battle for a lot of individuals, I suspect, when it's time to go back to work, because it's just like, oh, I want to go back to that rhythm that we used to have.
Well, you're not alone, Paula. You're really not alone. I think if that's anything that will come out of this, I think there will be a reluctance to go back to that rat race that we had. Yes, things will be competitive. Yes, things will still be busy, but I think we want to take it on a bit more of a human scale. I think that's the one thing that will come out of this.
Thank you very much for the
It was really a
time. And
pleasure.
I know you have to rush to another meeting, so thank you. It has been a pleasure. And hopefully we'll get to do this at another time, should you
Well,
have the availability.
if you and your audience would want to suffer through another few minutes with me, I'd be more than happy to return.
My daughter just came back from the dentist.
Yes.
She had a wisdom teeth removed. This is not painful. My audience is going to be happy, so don't worry. Thank you again.
Thanks again, Paula.
Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you. You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye-bye now.